It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's discussion on Libya, on the Syrian crisis, refugee crisis. I am very pleased to see so many of you. As you know, one of our guests is joining us from Turkey, where it's just about 5 a.m. So I think we should give him an applause. Before we start, I want to make one announcement. This Friday, we are going to have Niall Ferguson here in Kane Hall at 7 p.m. He will discuss his new biography of Henry Kissinger. The book was just published and has gotten very good reviews, so that's at 7 p.m. in Kane Hall 220, and it's a joint presentation between the Jackson School and the University Bookstore. Now, here in the Jackson School, we do international studies. And oftentimes, international studies turns out to be an excuse to talk about states, about wars, about relationship between states and big, important people. But really, the meat of international studies, of course, are the people who are influenced by the decisions that those important characters make. And oftentimes, of course, these people have little to say, if anything, about those decisions. In the Jackson School, all our colleagues have a deep interest about different parts of the world, different cultures, and different civilizations. So when we talk about big world events, we try to make, and we make an effort to bring in the human element into our discussions. And obviously, there is no other event in recent years that really calls for a discussion of the human dimension of what's going on in and around Syria. Now, we have here tonight a distinguished group of people who have different kinds of experiences about this issue, and they will talk to us about them. Before I introduce them, I have to make one statement, and that has to do with Mark, who is joining us from Ankara. Now, we are very fortunate to hear from such a high-level U.S. government representative as Mark Ward, and he is joining us via Skype. Now, we encourage open conversation here, and which we will have, but due to the nature of the circumstances of the subject matter that he is working on, he cannot be quoted or given any other identifying affiliation or attribution in print media. And this includes social media. So you can talk about this event, but you cannot refer to him personally about anything he may or he may not say. So if there is any media present, and if you want to talk to Mark afterwards, please get in touch with Monique. She will arrange for you to have an interview with him. So this is something I have to remind you, and I will remind you again before Q&A. So just very briefly, I will say a few things about our panelists. So Mark Ward is the director of the Syrian Transition Assistance and Response Team, which conveniently reads as START, at the U.S. Embassy in Ankara, Turkey. And that's where he's joining us from. And we will next hear from Neil McFarland. Neil McFarland is from the UW Medicine, a medical doctor, and he has wide-ranging experience working in emergency situations in the United States and in different parts of the world, including the Middle East. We will next hear from Jennifer Butte-Dahl. Jennifer is currently the director of the Applied Master's Program in International Studies in the Jackson School. She also volunteers for refugee organizations, and most recently, last month, she was in Lesbos working for a London-based refugee organization, NGO, volunteering and helping the Syrian refugees. We will next hear from Kathie Friedman. She's a professor of international studies here in the Jackson School, and she teaches on questions that have to do with forced migrations and refugees. And as a result of that, she follows these events very closely. So what we will do is, we will hear first from Mark, and then we will go and hear from our panelists, and then we will have a time for Q&A. So I ask each panelist to think about two questions. One is, based on their reading, following the events, or more importantly, of course, personal experiences in this part of the world, what is the latest? What is going on the ground? So we want to get a sense of what is going on. And then I also ask each one of the panelists to kind of look forward a little bit and say a few things about what is likely to be in about 6 months, what the situation is likely to be in about 6 months. Now, as I said earlier, most of our discussions here, especially the presentations, will focus on the immediate, on the human dimension. So the big questions that have to do with Russia and the US and the wars, etc., will come into the discussion inevitably. But the first part, we really want to take advantage of our panelists' experience and interest on the current issues, what's going on, and what it is like, and to get an understanding of that. So with that, I'm going to turn to Mark now and have him address those two questions and anything else that he might want to talk about.
Oh, okay. Should I just stay here, or should I be standing? Or does it...
I think that's good.
You have to come to Turkey.
Oh, awesome. So my name's Neil McFarland. I'm a physician for the University of Washington. I work. Oh, can
I guess
yeah. I just have to yell.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me now better?
Yeah.
A little bit? Okay. My name's Neil McFarland. I'm a physician for the University of Washington. I work primarily in urgent care. Here. Okay. Is it? Okay. Good. Are we okay?
Yeah.
All right. So my experience is a departure from our gentleman in Ankara here. I'm a medical doctor. I'm from Ohio, so I'm basically a standard issue white guy from the Midwest. I did live in Turkey for 6 months. I was in Istanbul, and I've done some volunteer work in various areas. My experience concerning this situation was I was planning to volunteer in a border town called Reşat, which is near Aleppo. And as I was packing to go, there was a truck bombing there, and it's still unclear what exactly happened in that particular situation. But I got kind of spooked, so I started calling around to some of my contacts, some of them here in Seattle, some others back in Ohio, and I hooked up with a couple organizations and ended up going to Jordan. And there's actually a good organization here in Seattle called the Salam Cultural Museum, run by a lady named Rita, who's done a phenomenal amount of work supporting medical and humanitarian efforts in various places, including Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, and most recently Greece. And so she asked me to come tonight and talk a little bit, and I don't know if I can give you really much expert opinion on anything, but I can tell you my experience. And compared to other situations, there's a phenomenal amount of problems. My reference frame is one of my first missions out of the country during medical school. I went down to Peru when Fujimori was in power, and if anybody's familiar with that situation, there was a group called Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path, and they started in a place called Ayacucho, and they were a political movement originally, but it became more aggressive, and they ran a lot of foreigners out of the country, including people who were there for medical purposes, and it caused the most marginalized people in their society to suffer tremendously. And that's similar to what I think we're seeing here. There's a lot of people that started in Syria that they have connections and resources, and they were able to simply relocate, go abroad, on their, an established passport and just, start someplace else. Whereas there's a lot of people there that don't have those resources, and they're in a much more dire situation. So the time that I was there was almost 2 years ago now, or just a little over, and I was primarily in Amman, Jordan, and the surrounding area. And basically we flew in, we met at a hotel, and Rita and some of her cohorts had sent over medical supplies that had been donated, including pharmaceuticals, equipment, wheelchairs, all sorts of things, just really basic things that people need. And then we would go out to various places in the community in and around Amman, and then also to the north on the Syrian border to a camp called Zatari. And if you know anything about the camp, it's probably similar to the ones in Turkey. It's one of the largest refugee camps on earth right now. I would not describe it as particularly nice, so I'm thinking the ones in... I didn't actually go into the ones in Turkey, but they looked a little nicer. They looked a little more organized. While I was there was an outbreak of Hep A, and there's just a lot of sanitation conditions that affected people's health there, and we couldn't, for some reason, get permission from the Jordanian government to vaccinate people for Hep A to help them in that respect. And it made an impression, because you're thinking, oh, well, who are these people? What are they doing? Were they working in there? What's their story? And I kept talking to people again and again. They're like, well, where are you from? And they're like, well, I'm from Aleppo, and I lived in a 3-story house, and I'm a professor at the university there, and I got bombed, so I ended up in this camp, and I lost a kid, and it's like, wow, this is sounding eerily similar to my life, in a mirror. So it's really heartbreaking. Since then, I came back here, and I've been working with Rita and the Cultural Museum to raise awareness, to come to different functions and talk with folks who are interested in learning about it, and pointing them towards ways to either volunteer or donate or put them in connection with people who can access equipment or medications. And I actually did not prepare anything, so this is just all me just randomly talking. Are there things that you guys are particularly interested in, or should we do a Q&A now, or should we just wait till afterwards?
Yeah, we'll do a Q&A.
Okay, so that's me in a nutshell. I hope that was informative. So I'll take some questions afterwards then. Okay, thanks guys.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming tonight. Mark, great to see you. So I'll just start with a caveat that I'm not a seasoned aid worker like Neil or like Mark. My kind of life before the UW was at the State Department, and that's how Mark and I know one another. But I think what I can offer is the personal side of this crisis, because I was a Middle East person. I worked on these issues most of the last 20 years, either from the region or from DC. I'd seen most crises through the lens of the 7th floor ops center in the State Department, where we pull together teams in the middle of the night to figure out who's doing what and which government is responding and where are we sending aid in and how much is each person giving. But I really wanted to have a field experience to really understand how these conflicts unfold from the ground. So that's one of the reasons that I volunteer with Shelterbox, which is a UK-based disaster relief organization. They have a US affiliate, and they run their aid missions relying mostly on a volunteer network of response team members based around the world who have gone through a significant amount of training to be able to, get on a plane hours after something happens, drop into a situation, and figure out what to do. So great organization. If you're at all interested in giving to an organization that's doing great work on the Syrian crisis, or perhaps if you're a student or not even, volunteering for an organization that would provide you with this kind of opportunity, I would suggest that you take a look at their website. So I spent the second half of August, first half of September on the Greek island of Lesbos or Lesbos, depending on what you prefer. And if you haven't heard of Lesbos, it wasn't really in the headlines before I left, but we had a significant crisis while I was there, and since I've gotten back, I feel like every headline is coming out of Lesbos. But it's really one of the gateways to Europe for refugees that are coming in from Turkey and elsewhere. At its nearest point, the northern beaches of Lesbos are 6 miles from the beaches of Turkey. You can look across this gorgeous water and see Turkey right there. And as you're looking, you're seeing small rubber dinghies coming toward you. At an alarming and unbelievable rate. When I arrived, we were receiving about 1,500 people a day, which was already exponentially greater than they had seen the month before. By the time I left, we were seeing 6,000 people a day arriving in boats. So these are, every hour you have a few. A lot of them come at night, and in the mornings and during the day, you're seeing thousands of people walking along the streets of this gorgeous Greek island that any of us would want to go on vacation to. It's small little villages, cute houses, wonderful little shops and bakeries. It's, vacation. But what is baffling and almost impossible to get your head around, no matter how long you stay, is the fact that you have a tourist population in a European country that's existing alongside a massive refugee crisis. And on any given day, you would see people dressed in, sundresses and shorts, clearly on vacation, having lunch on these beautiful waterside cafes while boats were landing on the beach next to them. And it has become normal, and that's so crazy. Thinking back to something that Mark said about the camps in Turkey being the best he's ever seen, the odd thing is, in Greece, there were no camps. Everyone, I think, has been baffled by this phenomena and unable to react appropriately just because it's Europe. and it seems like we should be able to have reception facilities for people. We should be able to quickly understand what we're dealing with and get facilities set up and have aid organizations come in and have the Greek government step up to do what they need to do to house, to feed, to take care of these people who have just fled war and terror. But that's not the case, and there's a million reasons, and I think Kathie will probably lead us into a number of those when she speaks about the various asylum issues that we're grappling with and European politics and a number of the other things. But imagine just big empty spaces where people like you and me, as Neil said, are camping out for days because they are not allowed to stay in a hotel because they don't have papers. They're not allowed to take a taxi because they don't have papers. And there's no shelter or camp set up of the type that Mark talked about, Zatari. You've seen these, camps with hundreds and thousands of tents. There's nothing like that in Greece for a number of reasons. So you just have kind of middle class, generally, people on the side of the road or, walking for miles. They land on the northern beach and it's 40 miles to get down to the port where they have to register with police. They can't get there by taxi, even though they have money, because it's against the law. So they have to take a bus. There are certain buses that UNHCR provides and MSF provides. But every time the port gets too crowded, the authorities shut the buses down. So you see people walking for days to try and reach the place where they're meant to register. On any given day, the registration processes change, and so they don't necessarily know where to go or when to go. They don't know what the process is going to be or when it's going to close or when it's going to reopen. And so you see just a lot of frustration on the part of many. To give you a sense of who's coming to Lesbos, the population there is about 70% Syrian, about 18% Afghan, and then about 4% Iraqi, and it goes down from there. But those were the big communities that are arriving. Who they are, I talked a little bit about it, and as Mark said, interestingly, we're hearing more about people leaving the camps. Just from my personal experience, when I was there, I didn't meet one person who was coming from a camp. I only met people who were fleeing Syria directly, obviously coming through Turkey, but none had spent more than kind of 2-3 weeks while they worked through the smuggling process, really, to get a boat. I've been, as you can imagine, I spent some weeks there and made a lot of friends, and now I speak to all sorts of Syrian refugees through Facebook and Viber and WhatsApp and email, and so I'm getting updates from them. Almost all of them have made it to Germany or Sweden, but they have, kind of explained how things are changing since we were there, so the changes. One of the things that they said is now in the last few days and week, they've seen a lot more people from the camps that are arriving in Lesbos. I don't know, it could have just been that I didn't meet anyone while I was there, or it could mean that there's a shift in population. There's also a sense of urgency that I'm hearing from people on the ground to move. This concern that Germany is going to shut its borders quickly. If you're going to get there, you need to go in the next kind of 2 to 3 weeks. It's hard to say what the cause is, but just to put it into context, if you look at last year's numbers versus this year's numbers, it's exponentially greater. I just was looking on UNHCR's site. They're doing a really great tracking site if you are watching this closely where they track the numbers they're counting each day to a number of destinations. And I take this with a little bit of a grain of salt because it's hard to say how anyone's tracking everything. But going to Reşat's question of what's going to happen in 6 weeks, or 6 weeks or 6 months? I don't know either, to be honest. If you look at arrivals to the Mediterranean last June 2014, they were 3,200. This June, they were 31,000. Last July was 3,900. This July was 52,000. By September last year, it was 7,500. This year, it's 161,000. It has gone up exponentially for the last 4 months, and it's been unlike anything that has been seen before. Most people in Greece will tell you that the arrivals kind of peak in September, October. So if that holds, what's held true over the last couple of years holds true now, then maybe this level of 160, 180,000, 200,000 maybe over September and October, and then when the weather gets cold and the sea gets a little more choppy, it goes down. It's hard to say. I think a lot depends on what comes out of Europe, what kind of agreements are made, what is in the news, what people are feeling constrained or pressured by in Turkey, in Syria, in Jordan, and in other places. But I think, things are definitely changing. When I arrived, we were building toward a crisis. Things had been very bad for a long time. And when I say that, I mean kind of complete chaos, no functioning camps with camp management, not enough toilets for everyone, people washing in fountains, not enough shelter, people sleeping on the streets, no registration process that was regularized. While I was there, we had kind of a massive crisis where the police became so overwhelmed by the numbers that kept coming in daily that they shut down registration for 3 days, which meant that we had between 17,000 and 25,000 refugees on the island at a particular time. And this is an island of 86,000 people total. So you had over a quarter of the population, which was refugees. And it was chaos. And the Prime Minister kind of called for all extraordinary measures to take care of the situation. Athens flew a major general, police major general in. We set up a mass registration in a field, and 17,000 people were processed and shipped off the island in ferries to Athens and kind of sent on their way in the space of 48 hours, which means you can do it if you need to. Today, the Greek Prime Minister went with the Austrian Chancellor to visit Lesbos. And I heard from people this morning, they sent me texts and WhatsApp messages saying, Jen, you won't believe it here. It's amazing. Like, everyone's gone. People are tweeting, there's nobody coming in on the beaches in the north. It's been quiet. The city is clean. There's no trash. There's no people. They're like, what? I don't understand what's happened. Well, clearly, there was orders given, and the Coast Guard was stepped up to do patrols. I don't know if they were pushing people back or they were bringing them to Lesbos. And they deployed a number of police in the camps to actually manage and run the registration processes. So I think it's a wait and see kind of situation, and things will change daily as we go and as various leaders, both in the EU, in the region, and here in the United States, make decisions about how we're going to manage a crisis that we haven't seen the likes of for.
Well, I teach immigration and refugee studies in the Jackson School. So like a good professor, I wrote a lecture. I made my class be guinea pigs for it today. It ran 45 minutes, so I hope you have water, supplies. But actually, I promised I would cut it down to 10 or 15 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to try. Okay. A global refugee crisis has been unfolding in Europe. So now I've moved out of the region to Europe. Driven by the accumulation of protracted conflicts that are not over still, and more persecution, particularly in Syria, Eritrea, Iraq, and Afghanistan, increasing numbers of refugees have been making the dangerous journey in smugglers' boats from the Turkish coast to the Greek islands. It takes around €1,000, approximately, to make the journey for an adult. Children are half price or free. In order to claim asylum in Europe, refugees can only arrive through clandestine or unauthorized means. This is expensive and perilous. If there were an alternative legal means of entry, say by a humanitarian visa, something like the historic Nansen passport between the wars, a non-stop flight from Bodrum, Turkey to Frankfurt, Germany would cost only about €200, rather than the 800 extra euros that the smugglers add on for their services. Existing legal, policy, and operational approaches to humanitarian protection for the most vulnerable seem to be falling apart. What has been most striking to me personally over the last month has been the unraveling of the EU as individual countries can't move fast enough to close borders and erect fences between themselves, as well as the near collapse of the post-World War II international refugee protection system. While civil society organizations and private citizens rapidly stepped up to welcome and assist the desperate and exhausted refugees. Whether the EU does unravel or the international humanitarian protection system does collapse, or whether very large numbers of refugees continue to seek resettlement in Europe over the long term, depends on the kind of policies that are adopted now and in the very near future. I'm going to start with enumerating very quickly some of the causes for the very recent surge in the flow of Syrian refugees to Europe, and then move on to talk about what Europe's obligations are to them. Second, I'm going to talk about what is happening now, what we can expect to see in the coming year with regard to refugee movement into the EU. And then I'm going to end with, actually I'm going to go off topic a little bit and end up with what I think is the right policy for protecting populations fleeing humanitarian crises. Not just what will happen, but what I think should happen if we make the right policies. Okay, so causes of the recent surge to the European Union. Okay, and I'm going to repeat what some of the other speakers have said very quickly. First of all, the war is entering its 5th year. There's no political solution in sight yet. People are losing hope. They're living in miserable conditions, some less miserable than others in Turkey or in Zaatari in Jordan, or no camps, self-constructed settlements in Lebanon. They're losing hope. They're miserable without a future. That's one reason. The cumulative effect of 4 years in exile has depleted their savings. They sold off their valuables, and they're facing deepening poverty. As Mark said, as Jen said, most refugees are not in camps, and so they're struggling to feed their families and pay rent. In most locations in neighboring countries in the region, there's restrictions on legal employment. So that's led refugees to informal employment for unscrupulous employers. They're begging in the streets. They're sending their children to work. They're sending their children to beg. They're forcing their daughters into early marriage. Although the Turkish government promised at one time to give work permits to Syrians, most are terribly exploited under the table in the informal sector. And in fact, smugglers often employ desperate refugees, promising free or reduced passage for bringing in new customers. Aid programs for refugees and host communities in the region have been plagued by chronic funding shortages. The 2015 UN plan for the region, it was only 41% funded when this crisis started in the late spring and summer. And that has meant cuts in food aid for thousands. On September 14th, the UN's World Food Program announced it would need another $330 million to keep feeding displaced Syrians until the end of this year. Last month, it stopped providing food aid to 360,000 Syrians in Jordan and Lebanon altogether, while the amount of food it provides to internally displaced in Syria was cut by 25%. Many refugees told UN workers that this was the last straw, cut in their food aid, and that was part of their decision to go to Europe. Maybe not in Turkey, but very limited education opportunities across the Middle East region, which is just means really lack of hope for the future generation. Not just adult refugees, but lack of hope for their kids. So what are the legal obligations of states when presented with a mass influx of people fleeing conflict or war? What are Europe's obligations or responsibilities toward those who seek asylum in Europe? Well, there is no single European border policy, though in theory, and if you look on the internet, there is something called the EU Common Asylum System. Directives from the European Commission set general standards that individual member states turn into law in their own national parliaments. Individual member states are in charge of their own borders, but they often coordinate with EU-wide agencies like Frontex, which is like our Coast Guard in essence in the US. And Frontex exists to protect external borders of the EU from smuggling, terrorist infiltration, illegal migration. In theory, however, refugees should be exempt from all those measures, since all EU states are signatories of the 1951 Refugee Convention. The UN Refugee Convention is unequivocal that every person has the right to seek asylum and must not be penalized for arriving without a visa or other travel documents. That's Article 31 of the Refugee Convention. Further, international law does not require asylum seekers to remain in the first country they reach, although the EU Dublin regulations does require it, but not the Refugee Convention that they have signed. States are forbidden to force asylum seekers back to any country where they would be in danger. Anybody who asks for asylum is entitled to have his or her claim evaluated through a status determination on an individual basis. The 1951 Refugee Convention spells out that a refugee is someone who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear, unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. Note, however, that fleeing generalized conflict or economic collapse because of war by themselves do not constitute grounds for asylum, and that's part of the problem. That's part of what we're dealing with here. There are, however, regional conventions in many parts of Africa and Latin America that accept what's called prima facie status determination. For example, if you're a Somali and you arrive in Kenya and you ask for asylum, just because you're Somali, you can get asylum in Kenya. That's all. You don't need to go through an individual status determination whether you fit those 5 grounds. But the trick, and this is what is being used by the EU, the trick is that states don't have to meet their refugee obligations if they can prevent refugees from reaching their territory in the first place. And that's what they've been trying to do. Since around 2000, the EU has been signing treaties with neighboring countries, giving them trade incentives and easier travel for their citizens if they committed to preventing unauthorized immigrants and asylum seekers from reaching the EU. This was the function that Spain, Italy, Greece, and Bulgaria performed along with Frontex for the wealthiest states of the EU. Those were the countries fingerprinting refugees, and if refugees were found outside of those countries, they were sent back to those original countries in the EU. The function of the countries just outside the EU, such as Morocco, Libya, Turkey, and the Ukraine, was to prevent refugees and unauthorized immigrants from reaching the periphery of the EU. This system began to collapse with the Arab Spring of 2011, and that's really when the border crisis in the EU began. Okay, let's see. So, in late September, the EU finally got itself up and voted to adopt a mandatory quota system to divide 160,000 asylum seekers among the various states. That's 160,000 only. Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania voted against it and said they won't comply. Britain said it will take some refugees from refugee camps, but not those who have already reached Europe. And by September 24th, in an emergency meeting with the EU heads of state in Brussels, they agreed to do the following. So this is sort of where we are now. This is on September 24th. This is what they agreed to. They're going to provide €1 billion in emergency aid to the UNHCR, the World Food Program, and other agencies working with refugees in the Middle East, in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey primarily. They're going to harden the borders, the external borders of the EU. They're going to deploy more teams to help Greece and Italy fingerprint, identify, and register refugees. And it sounds like in Greece they're somewhat successful if they want to be in terms of registering. They're going to tackle the smuggling problem and speed up deportations of those who don't qualify for asylum. They are going to cooperate more with non-EU countries like Turkey and some Balkan countries where a lot of refugees are now waiting to travel to the EU. And they're going to reestablish more holding camps for migrants outside of EU territory. And they're going to try and end the war in Syria. Okay. To sum up, the focus on all this aid that they finally organized themselves to provide, the focus remains on reducing migration to Europe and restoring the pre-2011 status quo. So what do I think we'll see in the next 6 months? I think the EU, the Schengen system, the UN Refugee Convention system is actually preserved now for the short run. I don't think it's going to collapse. It's kind of like they've plugged up or trying to plug up the holes in a crumbling dike, and so far so good. It's holding, and so I think the border crisis in Europe is, it's not at the kind of crisis level that we saw over the summer and the early fall. But that's the border crisis in Europe. How does this solve the Syrian refugee crisis? Well, I think both Jen and Mark had some of the recent news on refugees. They're still coming. In fact, on October 1st, there were reports that growing numbers of Syrian refugees have been returning to Syria from refugee camps in Jordan because they can't survive the drastic cuts in aid and they can't afford to pay smugglers to get them to Europe. The head of the UN Refugee Agency in Jordan says, and I quote him, "This signals a failure of the international protection system. But I think right now it's still unclear whether they plan to stay in Syria, whether it's a permanent return to Syria, or if they're returning to sell property so that they can afford the journey to Europe. I don't think we know yet." Meanwhile, although media coverage, at least in the United States, dropped considerably when the Pope visited, people are still traveling. And we see especially now people having not just arrived in Austria or Germany, but the arrival rate of people in Sweden and Norway, even Finland, which is rather unfriendly to refugees. People have been arriving. Okay, so what do I think is the right policy, even though you didn't ask? Okay. First, I think the world, given the kind of economic fragility in many states around the world that we see around this particular region, and given that kind of fragility of the economy, states are more and more unable to protect their citizens' human rights, and we're going to see continued migration throughout the region, continued out migration. That just will continue. It's the kind of global system that we are living in now. So given that migration will continue, but maybe not at the levels of the crisis that we've recently seen them, I think we absolutely have to affirm and protect the core principles of the UN Refugee Convention and the UN Humanitarian Protection System. Absolutely. Some people say it's time to drop it and change to something that's more relevant for today's world. I would say today's definitely not the time to drop it and try and get something better. We have to protect it. Second, I would argue that asylum seekers need to be allowed to travel legally to a country in which they can claim asylum so that they don't have to pay smugglers and make very dangerous journeys. Maybe there can be more consular offices near Europe's external borders. Third, states have to share the responsibility to assist refugees more equitably. Right now, responsibility is de facto allocated on geographical proximity, which presses the most economically vulnerable countries. That's a crazy system. The head of the UNHCR, I read, called upon member states 33 times in the recent year to assist the massive refugee flow, and not until September 2015 did Europe actually take him seriously. Fourth, this is a really hard one, but I think refugees need to be allowed to work legally. They have skills, they have educations, and they can actually support themselves if allowed to, and especially in Europe, can support an aging population with a declining birth rate. You know, Europe needs them. It just doesn't know it needs them yet. So maybe we need a rebranding. We need to call refugees not a burden, but an asset. And finally, this is even harder. I would say that the more legal channels you can have for non-refugees, people who are fleeing economic deprivation and general war and conflict situations, need to have a legal way to migrate, to immigrate. Yeah, thank you.
So we have some time for Q&A. I do want to remind you that you cannot quote Mark directly, but you can, of course, refer to the things he says without referring to him. The other thing I want to mention is Mark has to leave by 8:30 our time. So if you have a question for him, we should start with that, and we will go from there. Yes, and I will repeat your question so to make sure that you hear it. Yes. Yes.
Can you talk more about the risk in Aleppo getting bombed more? Do you have any insight into what's going on in Reşat or the potential for more refugees to be leaving Syria because of Aleppo?
Mark, the question is about Aleppo. If you have any information about the risk of Aleppo falling either to ISIS or to the government, which would generate, of course, a new wave of refugees.
Halab at all, but rather helps Hama and Ladaqiyya and Darfur to create a Alawi state. And if they do that, you're going to have millions more fleeing out of, especially Ladaqiyya.
Yes.
So,
If the question is basically what if there is a sort of a rump state of Syria, an Alawite state, and then that would generate a lot more people fleeing those areas to other parts of Syria and perhaps outside of Syria. I think, even without those things happening, it's already a very immediate and urgent refugee crisis. You can see this multiply perhaps, but the numbers that Jane gave is breathtaking, what happened between last year and this year. So there is a problem that has to be dealt with, and that's what we're trying to address here. And of course, I mean, either the causes that were mentioned earlier or possible scenarios from here forward need to be discussed, but I don't think that really takes away from the importance of the issue, the current urgency of the issue that we're trying to address. Are there any other, yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so it's rather a question slash comments. I just have the hunch in this refugee crisis. I mean, the danger is not foreseen right now, but it's maybe after like, I would say like 5 or 10 years maybe after the resettlement of this refugee. Is definitely, I mean, as people like, some people that old enough to remember Vietnam, old enough to, basically remember at least Vietnam War, and how we resettled them. It's not only resettled them, but also like for those who decided to make America a new home for them, like not only America, but across, whichever country that accept their asylum as their new home, is definitely their ability to adapt and move the social stairs.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons, and I mean, coming from the engineering background, I mean, well, Neil, we're brothers, almost sworn brothers, is that one thing that I found as one rather simple, rather maybe underlooked, but unfortunately this can make like a water and steam difference, is language education, language proficiency, which also become the gateway for another that like I would call it like certification, all those blah. I mean, Neil, you work with some doctors. I mean, definitely there's doctors in the refugee population, and for the sake, they don't. And I could sense that concern because they want to save people, but because they don't speak English, they don't have like all those proper medical education standards, become like a red tape for them to move, not only to move the social ladder, but to help people to move to other degree. So the thing that I'm thinking about is like there's a sense of crisis in the sense of language proficiency courses among those refugees, and I know there's definitely a lot of teachers that could volunteer, and on the other hand, on the parallel information, security agencies like FBI, CIA, or maybe the State Department are, I mean, every language professor knows this to be like the most cutting edge method of like language instruction like the world has ever seen. But the problem is, how can we, as a civilist academia, push like these people to basically enact like a massive program crash course for these refugees, not only like from civil education, because I mean, hey, they made it. Che Guevara successfully transformed the legend of Cuba, successfully transformed Cuba in just 10 years to double the life expectancy. I mean, if that can happen with a healthcare, that can happen with language, then like there's absolutely no damn reason we cannot do it with the refugees.
So
There's living examples.
Dr. Neal?
I'm really trying to wrap my head around what are we talking about? Like, can we teach people English? So I got these language CDs with Penciler. You just pop them in to the deck and you listen in the car.
Issues, man. I mean, you work with doctors, Neil. You work with engineers right there. I mean, back in Peru at least. I mean,
Yeah,
I mean, like,
we use a lot of translators. I don't speak Arabic,
oh, yeah.
but I speak really bad Turkish. But I still manage to volunteer and help out quite a bit because there's some things are go beyond language if you got your skill sets down. I think as far as the various things that we're looking at, that's certainly an issue. I wouldn't put it at the top of the list, but I definitely would address it. And I think we have some people on that.
Yes.
I was just wondering if one of you could answer a concern of mine that I remember a teacher of mine was talking about. A lot of times in Europe, we see pushbacks to refugees settling, and we see ghettoization of refugees. They settle in areas, and those areas then become kind of a hometown, like a little Syria or a little Jordan or such like that, where they don't really assimilate well in, let's say, the country that they're living in, let's say France, and they don't really enter kind of the society there. Like, do you see any any answer to this problem that has happened in the past? Like, do you see any possible actions that the EU can take to help assimilate these people into society?
Kathie?
Yeah, should I stand up? Yeah, okay. So, I mean, that's very similar to the previous question about learning English, I think. Yeah, you know, the U.S. in the early in the 1970s, in the Vietnamese rescue operations in the U.S., there was, for maybe 3 years, there was refugee cash assistance provided to new refugees in the United States. There were mandatory English language programs, cultural orientation. And now, depending on the size of the family, the communities where refugees are relocated, we're down to somewhere between 3 to 6 months or 3 to 8 months of refugee cash assistance. English language training is reduced. So if you're going to get in touch with your representatives, you want to ask, not just for more refugees being brought legally to the United States, but you want really assurance that once refugees, get to the United States, that they will be integrated properly. And I think that it's not just integration and assimilation isn't just a one-way street. So it's not just about refugees and immigrants becoming more like us. And unfortunately, in some bad ways, immigrants and refugees are becoming just more like us. Like maybe Neil can attest to that over time refugees are becoming overweight, are smoking more, are becoming unhealthy just like us. We don't want that kind of assimilation. Instead, what we want is, in terms of, we also want to learn from refugees and new immigrants. We want to change just as they want to change and blend into us also, and I think we all benefit that way. But we definitely need, very good integration programs. We don't want to accept, many, many more refugees in Seattle and then have people end up, on the street in winter without heat for their homes.
I would just add just one piece. As we look to Europe, obviously in the United States, we deal with our own struggles on assimilation in certain areas. I think Europe is dealing with this in various countries on different levels. I can speak to just where I was in Greece. You have a very tricky political balance that leaders are playing when they have a portion of their population that is very refugee accepting and a portion of their population that is xenophobic and completely against refugee arrivals, full stop. No assimilation, just go home. And so this is playing in a number of countries into that political discourse around what leadership is willing to step up and do. And it's not just a leadership problem, it's a problem at the level of the human. And it's a conversation that we need to have in Europe, it's a conversation that we need to have in our own country.
Yes.
Specific question, reference to something Professor Friedman said, but it's a question for everyone. Kathie, you mentioned one thing about how quickly it is to be granted asylum or refugee status, according to the convention. You have to prove that you're an individual or at risk because of your race, nationality, religion, political opinion, or social group. However, when you look at, for example, the Central American migration to the U.S., a
Is that? Maybe you should repeat the question quickly.
Okay. How does the Central American asylum seeker situation in the United States, how does that parallel or not the situation in Europe? Is that, Audrey, your question?
Part of it, or how the Syrian refugee crisis can fit into the legal framework when you have to have such specific, well-founded fears, not just fleeing from general violence.
Yeah. Well, the United States actually is expanding its Central American unaccompanied minor program. So I think the United States understands right now that there is a direct parallel and is accepting, giving asylum to some Central American kids fleeing violence. But it's a difficult sell.
I'm going to take two more questions. I see three hands. I'm going to take three questions. You and you and you. Let's just go like that. Yeah, go ahead. And then we'll address them together. Yes.
You said address it to, well, I'm not sure who to address it to.
No, I'm saying just say your question. We will answer all three questions together.
Yeah, I'm also having a hard time thinking it's a coincidence. I think Jennifer made the statistic that almost the entirety of the refugees into Greece are coming from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, which my understanding of the last three nations that we've had major military campaigns to one degree or another. And so coincidental, it seems a little strange that this keeps coming up. And I am a little, I think that the refugee crisis is obviously kind of awestruck in terms of how disastrous it's been. I also think that it probably is true. It seems like it could be a lot worse, but to not address in a fundamental way the cause of this crisis seems very dangerous. I mean, I know there's been a lot of statistics that have come out that a lot of the recruits that have been joining ISIS are affected by, for example, the Predator drone missions over the recent years. Obama has recently decided to increase these by 50%, I think, for the last couple months, which was far and above what we saw under the Bush administration, which was disastrous, as we saw. We saw a hospital bombed over the weekend that was, it's out of the question. That's unacceptable. And it seems like we should really be addressing from a standpoint of not just how many refugees can we take, but how can we actually address the cause of the crisis. And then just another question, one of the things that was referenced a number of times from a couple of the speakers was the United Nations, Human Rights Council, and other things that have come up. But as far as I can tell, the United States has not dealt with any United Nations Charter or Security Council or any type of vote or any legal process in the world community that would allow us to have a military policy of arming or funding an operation to change the government in another country.
Right, so this goes back to an earlier comment too. We should kind of address this deeper kind of background, responsibility of the U.S. policies going back to at least 2003, if not more, in this situation. So I think we should keep that. And then, yes?
Mine's more of an organizational question. So for the encampments, it sounds like, is there a structure for the regulatory agency that takes responsibility for the encampments? And if so, what does that look like? Because it sounds like the government didn't allow vaccinations in Jordan. Are they the ones that are in control of those encampments, or do they delegate some subcontract that out to UNHCR?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's just think, keep that.
Oh, sorry.
And then you were left.
Okay, have the EU thought about giving Greece like debt forgiveness? Or taking refugees.
Okay, so we have 3 questions. I'm just gonna let you just address them, any one of you, all of you. You know, you wanna take that?
Sure, yeah, I'll
Run that
jump in on the policy thing. So there's a lot of players and people want to make sure that things are being done the right way. One of the things that happened, for instance, when I was in Jordan is some people were sneaking in pain meds and Viagra to sell. And they said that they were on a medical mission and they clearly were not. So that really tightened down how we were able to import medications and medical equipment. It was a severely negative impact. The Jordanian government had a policy essentially that if we were going to vaccinate refugees in the camps, they wanted also all of their children to be vaccinated as well. And I don't think it's an unreasonable approach, but it certainly wasn't particularly helpful in the middle of an outbreak that we couldn't jump in and vaccinate the people who are most at risk. So you have to understand that the people need to maintain the integrity of their own country. The Jordanians are having problems with that, the Turkish are having problems with that, and it's, I think like we've talked about, you know, there's various parties pulling strings, and there's a lot of security issues. It's not solely an issue of accepting a refugee from a place that's having a war, but the war is kind of spilling over.
Right, it's a little bit of a loaded question. I visited for a little bit, and I have a background in sanitation, and we went and actually talked with part of the government, and it was really interesting because we couldn't get a straight answer on the question I just asked, where they would do wastewater testing to make sure that the effluent was coming out at a certain level, but they wouldn't take responsibility for providing wastewater treatment for the actual camps themselves, and so just understanding when you have a huge population of refugees that come in, who takes responsibility for that?
Who runs that?
Yeah, I don't think if you stayed in the camp you would get that answer either.
Yeah.
I certainly never did, because I mean the people I worked with Salam Cultural Museum here. I worked with National Arab American Medical Association. I worked with Syrian SAMS, the Syrian American Medical Society. A lot of connections there. I don't think anybody in any of those organizations could tell us exactly how that was working. It's something that was relegated to a bureaucrat within the Jordanian government that wasn't willing or able to give a straight answer.
Any thoughts from the State Department background?
I don't represent the State Department anymore, but I still sometimes use the collective we. No, I would say a couple things. One, I think relief operations are different everywhere. They unfold in different ways with various government officials at the local, state, and federal levels taking greater or lesser amounts of responsibility, with different international organizations coming in and taking varying levels of responsibility, and from local nonprofits or local organizations or actors taking different levels of responsibility. You know, one of the problems we were having in Greece is that nobody knew who was in charge. For the entire 3 weeks I was there, we would be asked every day by the Syrians, you know, how is this gonna unfold? Where do I go for registration? Who tells me what tent I'm supposed to go in? And we would be also asking UNHCR and the mayor and there was no clear answer because you're in a crisis. I think some of these longer term crises where you have the UN cluster system that's set up where, you know, you come in, there's different groups of people working on water and sanitation and on health and on shelter. You know, then you're farther down the road and there's more of a person to point to when you need an answer on a particular thing. In the early days of some of these crises, those systems aren't set up and everyone is just grappling with what to do and who can make a decision and, you know, who says yes or no. On the EU question, I would just say I don't see debt forgiveness in the future. I think it's interesting though. One thing that kind of shocked me, the first Monday I was in Greece, there were at least 50 people outside every single bank and 8 p.m. at 9 a.m., which was a reminder that Greece, on the front lines of this crisis, is a poorly run country normally. That's in the middle of an economic crisis and a political crisis and now a refugee crisis. And so, I think many people, policymakers, local organizations, locals in these countries have been calling on the EU to give them more assistance. I saw today with the Austrian Chancellor going together with the Greek Prime Minister to Lesbos was this supposed to be a show of support, I think, that, Europe, mainland Europe cares about the front line. And the Austrian Chancellor said that they're sending 100 people. I don't know what those 100 people are going to do, but 100. Frontex also said last week that they're deploying 775 officials to Greece and Italy to assist. And this is something that, the leadership in both countries have been calling for weeks, for months, for the past years. This is not something that just started this summer. This has been happening now for 4 years, but the numbers were just so much lower. I think now there's a wake-up call that they can't do it on their own, and it's a disaster. And it just creates more problems going up the line. And if you could somehow fix some of the registration issues at the front, then you would have a smoother process. But as Kathie said, there is what did you call it? A coordinated asylum procedure for Europe.
Common European asylum
Right,
system.
which doesn't actually
Really work.
exist
No.
because
On the
you think
website.
about it, it takes days on Lesbos for someone to get a piece of paper that says, please show up in Athens, who knows how many days later, because it's all in Greek. And so, you just get it and you get on the ferry, you get your way to Athens, you get to the next border crossing, and you go through their process, and you re-register, and you get another piece of paper that gets you to the next border crossing, and you do it again. And until Europe sorts that out, it's going to be like this.
But my understanding is that Angela Merkel has made a statement that she doesn't plan to go on talk shows and make any more refugees cry.
You want to address that bigger question about U.S. responsibility causes? It came up twice.
I was, in the next 6 minutes, I guess I would just say, if we're going to look at Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, we're going to go back over 15 years now and kind of make our way through hundreds, if not thousands, of different policy decisions that were made by 2 different administrations. There's a lot of ground to cover there. Personally, I worked in both the Bush and Obama administrations on Middle East policy. Not everything always went the way I wanted it to go, but what I can say is that there are a lot of good people in the system who have been trying to do the right thing, still are trying to do the right thing. We haven't always done the right thing, but here we are. And we need to look forward and see how we're going to help all of these countries get back on their feet. And more. We've got now Yemen and Libya and, others that you didn't mention. So
I think I'm going to thank you all for coming and staying, and thank you for the
I didn't know Greg's the one that I mentioned.